Ask the average person online what evidence exists for the resurrection of Jesus, and you'll get one of two responses, either a blank stare or a confident there is none. No hesitation, no nuance, just there is no evidence, case closed, except it isn't. Because the historical case for the resurrection is so well documented, so thoroughly argued, that even atheist scholars have had to build entire careers around explaining it away. Not dismissing it, explaining it. There's a difference. And that difference is the thing nobody in your comment section wants you to look at. Let's be honest about where the no evidence claim comes from. It doesn't come from historians. It doesn't come from New Testament scholars, not even the skeptical ones. It comes from people who've never engaged with the actual argument. The skeptic pipeline works like this. Someone watches a YouTube video, reads a Reddit thread, absorbs the vibe that resurrection is obviously mythology, and moves on. They never encounter the primary sources. They never read what historians, including the ones who don't believe it happened, actually say about the data. And the data is uncomfortable. Not because it proves God exists, but because it refuses to behave the way ancient myths are supposed to. Let's start with the oldest piece of evidence we have. Not the Gospels. Something earlier. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. Paul writes, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. This isn't Paul theologizing. This is Paul quoting a creedal formula, a memorized summary of belief that predates his own letter. How do we know? The language, the structure. The Aramaic name, Cephas instead of the Greek Peter. Scholars across the spectrum, from evangelical to atheist, agree this creed dates to within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion. 3 to 5 years. Not decades, not centuries, years. That means the claim that Jesus rose from the dead wasn't some legend that slowly evolved over generations. It was the founding claim of the movement from day one. The people making this claim were the same people who would have been in a position to know whether it was true. James Dunn, one of the most respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century, called this creed the earliest tradition we can trace. Gerd Ludemann, an atheist scholar, dated it to within 2 years of the crucifixion. 2 years. You can't get legend development in 2 years. You can barely get a rumor started in 2 years. Here's a fact that doesn't get enough airtime. Roughly 75% of scholars who have published on the subject, including non-Christians, accept the historicity of the empty tomb. Why? Multiple reasons. First, multiple independent sources report it. Mark, the early creed, the special material in Matthew and John. These aren't copying each other, they're independent attestation pointing to the same event. Second, the criterion of embarrassment. In first-century Palestine, women's testimony was considered unreliable. It was inadmissible in Jewish courts. And yet every gospel account names women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb. If you're inventing a resurrection story in that culture, you don't make women your star witnesses. You just don't, unless that's actually what happened. Third, the Jewish authorities never denied the tomb was empty. Their counterargument wasn't the tomb is still occupied. It was the disciples stole the body. That's an admission. They're conceding the empty tomb and offering an alternative explanation. If the body was still in the ground, that's the end of Christianity on day one. Just point to the tomb. Nobody pointed to the tomb. Here's the part that makes the conspiracy theories fall apart. Christianity didn't start in some backwater province hundreds of miles from the events. It started in Jerusalem, the same city where Jesus was publicly executed and buried. Weeks after the crucifixion, Peter is standing in the middle of that city, preaching to crowds that the man the authorities just killed is alive again. Think about what that requires. If the resurrection is a hoax, the disciples chose to launch it in the one place on earth where it could most easily be disproven. The tomb was right there. The Roman and Jewish authorities who oversaw the execution were right there. The people who watched Jesus die were right there. Everyone had access. Everyone had motive to shut this down, and yet the movement didn't get crushed. It grew, in Jerusalem, under the noses of the very people who had the most to lose from it being true. The authorities arrested the apostles, flogged them, threatened them, but the one thing they never did was produce a body. That's not because they didn't want to, it's because they couldn't. If you're going to argue that the resurrection was fabricated, you have to explain why the fabricators chose the worst possible city to launch the lie. You have to explain why the people with the power and the motive to expose the fraud never managed to do it. And you have to explain why, within weeks, thousands of people in that same city believed it. People who could have walked to the tomb themselves. The silence from Jerusalem isn't ambiguous. It's deafening. After the crucifixion, multiple independent sources report that individuals and groups claim to have encountered the risen Jesus. Not visions, not dreams. Encounters, physical, interactive, and in some cases involving meals and conversations. Paul lists the appearances in that early creed. Peter the 12, a group of over 500, James, all the apostles, and finally Paul himself. He's writing this in the mid-50s AD, roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, and he says most of the 500 are still alive. That's not a mythological flourish. That's a man saying, "Go ask them yourself." The appearances weren't limited to believers. They weren't limited to one location or one emotional state. They were reported by individuals alone, by small groups, and by large groups, across multiple settings. This matters because the most common naturalistic explanation, hallucination, doesn't work for groups. Hallucinations are individual psychological events. They don't happen to 500 people at once. 2 conversions blow a hole in almost every skeptical theory. The first is Paul. Before his conversion, Paul, then Saul of Tarsus, was actively persecuting Christians. He was overseeing the arrest and execution of believers. He had every ideological reason to destroy this movement, and then, by his own account, and the account of others, he encountered the risen Christ and became the most prolific missionary in Christian history. People don't usually join movements they're trying to destroy, especially when joining that movement means losing your status, your safety, and eventually your life. The second is James, the brother of Jesus. During Jesus' ministry, James was a skeptic. The Gospels record that Jesus' own family thought he was out of his mind. James was not a follower, and then, after the crucifixion, something happened that turned this skeptical brother into the leader of the Jerusalem church, a position he held until his execution in 62 AD. What turns a hostile witness into a martyr? What turns a skeptical brother into a church leader? The standard answer from skeptics is religious experience. But that's not an explanation. That's a label. The question is, what caused the experience? Every alternative to the resurrection has been proposed, examined, and largely abandoned by serious scholarship. The stolen body hypothesis, the oldest counter-explanation, dating back to the Gospels themselves, requires a group of frightened, scattered disciples to overpower Roman guards, steal a corpse, and then spend the rest of their lives being tortured and killed for something they knew was a lie. Nobody finds this convincing anymore. The swoon theory that Jesus survived the crucifixion was demolished by David Friedrich Strauss in the 19th century, and Strauss was no friend of Christianity. He pointed out that a half-dead man crawling out of a tomb would not have inspired a resurrection movement. He would have inspired pity and medical attention. The hallucination theory, the most popular modern alternative, fails on multiple fronts. Hallucinations are individual, not collective. They don't happen to hostile witnesses like Paul. They don't produce an empty tomb. And they don't explain why the disciples were suddenly willing to die for a claim they could have easily recanted. The legend theory that the resurrection story developed over time runs headfirst into the early creed. You can't have legendary development within 3 to 5 years when the eyewitnesses are still alive, and the community is small enough that anyone could fact-check the claims. Each alternative explanation accounts for some of the evidence. None of them account for all of it. And that's the problem skeptics don't want to sit with. Here's what gets overlooked in almost every online debate about the resurrection. The origin of the Christian church itself is a historical fact that demands explanation. Something happened in first-century Jerusalem that turned a small group of devastated, scattered Jewish followers into a movement that would reshape the Roman Empire within 3 centuries. These were observant Jews, people whose entire identity was built around Sabbath worship, monotheism, and Torah observance. And within 1 generation they shifted their day of worship from Saturday to Sunday, the day they claimed Jesus rose. That's not a small thing. Devout Jews don't casually change their holy day. Something seismic had to cause that shift. N.T. Wright, arguably the foremost resurrection scholar alive, makes a crucial point. First-century Jews believed in a general resurrection at the end of time. Nobody, not a single Jewish group, was expecting the resurrection of one individual in the middle of history. The disciples had no theological framework for what they claimed happened. They weren't fulfilling an expectation. They were scrambling to explain something that didn't fit their categories. If they made it up, they made up the one thing nobody was expecting. That's a strange invention. And there's one more thing that almost never comes up. In Jewish culture, the tombs of prophets and holy men were venerated, treated as sacred sites, places of pilgrimage and devotion. This was standard practice. When a revered teacher died, followers honored the burial site. It happened with Abraham, with David, with the prophets. There are archaeological remains of these venerated tombs all over the ancient Near East. So where is the tomb veneration for Jesus? It doesn't exist. There is no evidence that the earliest Christians treated Jesus' burial site as a shrine. No pilgrimages, no markers, no devotion to the place where the most important figure in their movement was laid to rest. That's a glaring absence, unless the tomb was empty and the community's focus had shifted entirely to the living person they claimed to have encountered. You don't venerate a tomb when you believe the person walked out of it. The silence around the burial site isn't a gap in the historical record. It's the record telling you exactly what those first Christians believed had happened. Here's where it gets really interesting. The scholars most hostile to Christianity still concede the core facts. Gerd Ludemann, a committed atheist, accepts the early creed, the appearances, and Paul's conversion as historical. His explanation? The disciples had grief hallucinations. He accepts the data and offers a naturalistic interpretation, but he doesn't deny the data. Bart Ehrman, the skeptic community's favorite scholar, has written extensively that Jesus existed, was crucified, and that his followers genuinely believed they encountered him after his death. Ehrman doesn't believe in the resurrection, but he doesn't pretend the evidence isn't there. E.P. Sanders, John Dominic Crossan, Paula Fredrickson, these are not evangelical apologists. These are mainstream, often skeptical historians who all affirm the same basic facts. Jesus died by crucifixion. His followers claimed to see him alive afterward, and those claims launched a movement that changed history. The debate among scholars isn't whether these things happened. The debate is what caused them, and that's a very different conversation than there's no evidence. You don't have to believe Jesus rose from the dead. That's a conclusion each person has to wrestle with on their own. But you cannot, not honestly, not intellectually, say there's no evidence. There is a creed dating to within years of the event. There is an empty tomb that even opponents conceded. There are multiple independent reports of post-mortem appearances. There are hostile witnesses who converted. There are alternative explanations that collapsed under scrutiny. And there are atheist scholars who accept the core facts and spend their careers trying to explain them without invoking the supernatural. That's not no evidence. That's a mountain of evidence you were never told about. And the reason you were never told is because it's a lot easier to scroll past a Reddit comment that says there's nothing there than it is to sit with the possibility that the most investigated event in ancient history might actually have happened. So the next time someone tells you the resurrection is just a fairy tale with no evidence behind it, ask them one question. Which scholar are you getting that from? And then watch the silence. If you want to follow the evidence wherever it leads, subscribe. We're just getting started.